Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to take you back to when I was 15 years old. I was only 15 when he first came home. I could hardly hear him speak because he spoke so softly. And I was this bag of loud giggles. My mother would often say to me, "Look at you and look at him. When are you going to learn to speak softly?" He didn't have a voice. His voice was choked by the agony of seeing his mother die in a fire. He witnessed his mother burn alive at the tender age of 5. With the death of his mother, he had lost his nurturer, and he was extremely traumatized. To add to his trauma, there entered a stepmother in his life, and he was sent away to a boarding school. He ran away from the boarding school and found himself a new home in a school friend's family. While he was in boarding school, he learned something. Life sucks and drugs work. That was his experience in the dorms of the boarding school. From a very young age, he had to earn his own money, and now he was here in our lives, in my life. At that time, I was preparing for my first diploma exam in high school. And he was here to help me with math. My father had brought him in. I sucked at math. I was this dreamy-eyed student of literature, hopelessly romantic and in love with everything. And this was totally different for me. I didn't want to study math with him. So I convinced him and influenced him eventually to graduate into studying literature with me. There was so much to talk about and so much to discuss. And then one day, he shared with me his hidden treasure. He wrote beautiful poetry. The more I read his poems, the more I wanted him to write. Each piece was an exquisite work of brilliance and beauty. I saw his mind and his spirit in them. I bought him a journal and asked him to write poems just for me. I became his biggest fan. Fast forward 3 years later, he had already won hearts of everyone in my family, and he had landed a fantastic job as a computer software programmer. And we were engaged. And then a few years later, it was my wedding night, a night that most women dream of. Strangely enough, he spent the whole night in a washroom while I was sitting and waiting for some good poetry from him. I was a bit confused and eventually feeling very hurt because I sat through the whole night up until early morning waiting for him. What I didn't realize that my wedding night was the warning of a big storm coming in my life. So let me tell you one thing. Before that, I had never, ever met anyone who had an addiction. And I had no idea about drugs, what they were. So during the time when we were engaged, he once had a conversation with me where he told me that people were gossiping that he was smoking weed, but he was actually smoking cigarettes occasionally. Now, what was weed? That was a new word for me. He called it grass. And I said, "Is this some kind of a joke? Do people pull out grass from meadows and start smoking it? What on earth is that? I'd never heard of something like that." And I couldn't believe that he would be anyone who would be an addict. He never looked like one. Going forward, I was married and living with him. My married life was stuck between weekend to weekend. One weekend where he spent all his time hanging out with his bachelor friends. And the other weekend that I understood later was when he was going cold turkey. And between those kinds of weekends, I lived days where he spent his whole day at work. And then he claimed that he was doing overtime. And then he came back home very, very late. I spent all my evening sitting at the window or on my balcony waiting for him to come home. As he progressed in his career, he did very well. He made a lot of money, but what I didn't understand was there was never enough. There was always never enough, and I couldn't understand where the money was going. The more money he made, the less time he spent with us. And then eventually my father and my sister-in-law had to support us financially, and yet there wasn't enough. This is how I was living my life. And 2 years after my marriage, I was about 6 months into my pregnancy. I had won a scholarship for a computer software program, and I used to go every Saturday for my classes. And Saturday was his day off, and he would stay at home. While this was happening, on one Saturday, I went to class, and class was canceled. So I was really happy that I'm going to go home and surprise my husband. We're going to have a great time together. So I got on a bus. I didn't let him know that I was coming. And then I went up to my door, unlocked the door very quietly, and then I tiptoed into my house to hear voices from the bedroom. When I walked into the bedroom, the lights were turned out. There were two men sitting on the floor. One of them was my husband and the other his friend. There was a candle lit. There were silver foils in their hands, and there was thick smoke in the room. I was shocked. I had that drug thing in my mind, somewhere at the back of my mind, and this was something totally new that I saw. And I thought, is this what they call drugs? Is this really happening? Is this true? And he looked up at me and he said, "You're hallucinating. You're pregnant. There is nothing happening here." I kicked the mug that was on the floor to convince myself that what I was seeing was real. And that's when it landed on me that he was doing drugs. I didn't know what to do with it because I had no idea. And so all I did that evening was begged and begged him to stop this. I couldn't believe that he could do this to me and my daughter, my baby. And I thought he loved us. So after that, it used to be very painful for me to see him struggle. He was struggling with his addiction. He was trying to get rid of it on his own. And he quit the habit, and then he would keep relapsing. And every time he relapsed, it got worse. The addiction started getting stronger. And eventually, he ended up in a rehab center. That was a new thing for me. And then my life was totally different. Then he couldn't handle his job. He used to be in and out of rehab centers most of the time. And every time he came out of a rehab center, he relapsed. He lied. He stole. And he was in debt. So going forward, we didn't have rent to pay for the house. We didn't have money to send my daughter to school. And he kept deteriorating. He didn't look good. His appearance had deteriorated. His relationships with people had deteriorated. His career had deteriorated. And we were not being able to pay our bills. So I thought it was my idea, let's relocate to a different city. Yes, it worked. He had a new job. We had a new home. My daughter had a new school. And then he had new drug peddlers and new addictions. And now, it was all of the previous addiction and needles. At the end of everything, what happened to us was he couldn't give up his addiction. We became homeless. We were thrown out of his father's house because we relocated in 3 different cities. And then eventually, we had to fall apart as a family. Fast forward, what happened to my life? He didn't hit rock bottom as yet, but what happened to my life was I ended up in Canada, marrying a second time, and the rest of it was a big nightmare that we'll talk about another day. So my message to everyone, I spoke with him before I came to speak here, and I asked him, what is one message you'd like to share? What should I tell my audience? What should I tell the people here? And his message was, you have to start again like a child and not carry the baggage of whatever you've been going through or dealing with in your life. All I have to say to everyone, especially to those who are dealing with addiction, get a high on life. Live and let live. Love and let love. Thank you.